The night everything changed did not begin with shouting or broken glass or some dramatic confession. It began with a look, a deliberate, lingering look from a man who believed authority made him untouchable. I remember the ballroom lights reflecting off polished marble floors, the hum of conversations layered over clinking crystal, the kind of corporate celebration designed to reward ambition and disguise moral compromise. My wife, Seraphine Alder, stood near the center of the room in a deep emerald gown that cost more than my first car. She had earned her place there, or at least that's what I used to tell myself. 12 years at her firm, rising from analyst to chief brand strategist, reshaping campaigns, doubling revenue streams. I was proud of her success even when it devoured our evenings and hollowed out our conversations. I stood off to the side holding a glass of bourbon I barely touched, watching her laugh at something her superior said. Then he turned his head slowly and looked directly at me, not casually, not accidentally, intentionally. His name was Adrian Kessler, founder of Kessler Dynamics, a man who wore confidence like a tailored suit. He didn't break eye contact when he spoke his next words. "Join me for dinner tomorrow night," he said to Seraphine, his tone smooth but loaded. "Just you and me. We'll talk about your advancement." The room didn't quiet, the music didn't stop, but in my mind everything narrowed to that moment. She hesitated for half a breath. Then she smiled. "That sounds wonderful," she replied. No glance toward me for reassurance. No discomfort, just calculation and consent. I set my drink down without finishing it. I didn't protest. I didn't argue. I didn't create a spectacle. I walked out of the ballroom and into the cool night air, feeling something inside me close like a vault door sealing shut. My name used to be Elias Mercer. I was 49 years old at the time, a senior intellectual property litigator who had built a career protecting innovations from theft, drafting contracts so precise they could withstand years of scrutiny. I understood hostile takeovers, silent acquisitions, strategic dismantling. What I failed to recognize was that my own marriage had been undergoing a slow corporate raid for years. By the time that dinner invitation was accepted, the erosion had already happened. The drive home that night felt longer than usual even though the distance hadn't changed. I parked in the garage at 10:58 p.m., cut the engine, and sat in darkness listening to the metallic ticking as it cooled. The neighborhood was pristine, curated hedges and warm porch lights projecting curated happiness. I considered storming back to confront her, demanding explanations, but confrontation implies negotiation. What I had just witnessed wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and choices have consequences. As I sat there, the analytical side of my mind took over, the same compartmentalized precision I used when structuring asset shields for clients facing aggressive competitors. I realized something uncomfortable. I had already begun preparing for this moment nearly a year earlier, not consciously as revenge but subconsciously as insurance. Documents had been signed, accounts had been adjusted, ownership structures had shifted under the banner of tax efficiency and estate optimization. I hadn't known exactly why I felt compelled to protect myself then. Now I did. When Seraphine returned home past midnight and moved quietly through the house without coming to find me, that final confirmation settled in. She wasn't worried about what the invitation had meant. She assumed I would absorb it like I had absorbed everything else. The months leading up to that night had been filled with small adjustments that appeared harmless on the surface. I had suggested transferring the property title into a revocable trust for liability insulation. She signed without reading beyond the executive summary. I proposed restructuring our joint brokerage account to maximize long-term tax efficiency. She approved it between conference calls. I separated retirement instruments under the guise of diversification strategy. I established a holding entity for secondary assets citing future inheritance planning. Each signature was notarized, documented, archived. Each modification was entirely legal. She trusted me implicitly with paperwork because it bored her. That trust became leverage. By the time Adrian Kessler extended his dinner proposal, The architecture of our shared life had already been quietly redistributed. I spent that first sleepless night in my study reviewing everything with cold detachment. Deeds, trust certificates, authorization letters, beneficiary adjustments. I wasn't improvising. I was executing. At 3:12 a.m., I finalized the last internal transfer that separated liquid reserves from the visible accounts she monitored. Not stolen. Reallocated under agreements she had signed willingly months earlier. At dawn, I packed a modest travel case, 3 changes of clothing, encrypted storage devices, essential documents. I placed the house keys and garage remote neatly on the kitchen counter beside a sealed envelope containing copies of every restructuring instrument. No explanation letter, no accusations, just facts. When I stepped outside at 6:41 a.m., the sky was streaked in amber light. It felt less like fleeing and more like shedding skin. I did not disappear recklessly. I relocated strategically. A secondary vehicle registered under the holding company awaited 3 blocks away. By 7:15 a.m., I was heading east along a highway that cut through farmland and low, rolling hills, leaving behind the curated perfection of suburbia. I had no dramatic soundtrack playing in my head, no triumphant rage, just clarity. The new phone activated in my glove compartment connected to accounts created months prior. Secure email servers, encrypted cloud backups, contingency legal contacts. I had structured my exit with the same meticulous care I once reserved for multi-million-dollar intellectual property disputes. 3 days later, I checked into a modest roadside inn outside a coastal town nearly 300 miles away. From there, I monitored what unfolded. Shared digital accounts gave me visibility into her escalating panic, calls to my former office, messages to mutual acquaintances. An inquiry filed with local authorities reporting me missing. The authorities responded exactly as I predicted. An adult leaving voluntarily is not a crime. Watching her scramble did not bring me joy. It brought confirmation. She had not considered the possibility that I would ever refuse to be background furniture in my own life. Within a week, she retained counsel. I anticipated that as well. My longtime colleague, Martin Hale, contacted me with updates. Her attorney intended to challenge the property transfer citing misrepresentation. That argument collapsed under scrutiny because notarized attestations confirmed her awareness and voluntary consent. There was no coercion, no hidden clauses, just indifference on her part when signing. When she attempted to access consolidated retirement assets, she discovered they had been repositioned within a charitable foundation trust I administered under joint authorization months earlier. Legally sound, documented. She had signed those directives too. Martin informed me that her legal strategy was weakening by the hour. "She's realizing there's nothing to claw back," he said during one call. I felt neither vindication nor cruelty. I felt exhausted. 2 decades of emotional erosion had led to this. I wasn't stripping her of survival. I was withdrawing the invisible subsidy of being taken for granted. Meanwhile, rumors circulated through corporate circles. Adrian Kessler's company faced mounting litigation over proprietary technology disputes abroad. Stock values trembled. Internal investigations surfaced. I had tracked those vulnerabilities months earlier out of professional habit, not sabotage. When regulatory penalties were announced publicly, the firm's stability faltered. Seraphine's position, once secure, became precarious overnight. My daughter, Leora, complicated everything. At 24, she had just begun her own career in environmental design in another state. I had called her the afternoon before the gala simply to say I loved her, unaware it would be the last conversation before rupture. When she learned I had left, confusion bled through her voice. I limited communication initially, fearing that any direct contact would be intercepted or manipulated into narrative leverage. Eventually, I sent her a secure message assuring her of my safety and promising an explanation when the emotional debris settled. She deserved honesty, but not while events were still volatile. Meanwhile, Seraphine's professional world continued unraveling. Kessler Dynamics filed for restructuring under creditor protection following a staggering financial judgment. Executive bonuses were frozen. Positions were dissolved. Seraphine's role evaporated with minimal severance due to liquidity constraints. I learned of her termination through automated alerts and industry publications. For years, she had prioritized that ascent over anniversaries, over shared dinners, over counseling sessions I once suggested. Now the ladder she had climbed disintegrated beneath her. I did not orchestrate that downfall, but I refused to intervene to cushion it. Weeks stretched into months. I relocated again, this time to secluded property owned by a retired widower named Harold Whitcomb who rented cabins seasonally without asking invasive questions. The mountains offered anonymity and perspective. I spent long hours walking forest trails, interrogating my motives. Was this revenge? The word implies anger driving destruction. What I felt was reclamation. For years I had negotiated myself downward to preserve peace. I had accepted invisibility in exchange for stability. The dinner invitation had not been the betrayal, it had been the exposure of a pattern long normalized. In quiet moments I replayed memories of earlier conversations, my attempts to schedule time together to attend therapy to protect one evening a week from professional intrusion. Each request had been deferred, after this quarter, after this campaign, after this promotion. There was always a horizon that never arrived. Eventually I stopped asking, and when you stop asking, you start preparing. Digital discourse about my departure began circulating online after fragments of legal filings leaked through professional networks. Commentators debated whether I embodied empowerment or cruelty. I ignored most of it until Leora called one evening, her voice steadier than before. She had confronted her mother about the gala incident. Seraphine deflected, minimizing the invitation as harmless networking. Leora sensed evasion. "Dad," she asked me, "was it really just dinner?" I told her the truth without embellishment. It wasn't the meal. It was the pattern of disregard culminating in public dismissal. Silence followed on the line before she exhaled slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand," she said. That understanding did not heal everything, but it marked the first shift. Several months after my departure, Seraphine drove to the mountain property unannounced. I was stacking firewood when her car emerged at the end of the gravel drive. She looked diminished, not physically, but in certainty. We spoke on the porch as dusk settled. She apologized, though the apology felt tethered to consequences rather than introspection. She asked me to halt what she perceived as humiliation. I explained calmly that I had no interest in humiliation. I had interest only in accuracy. For years I had expressed loneliness within the marriage. Those conversations were dismissed as overreaction. The gala merely crystallized what had been ongoing. She accused me of premeditated escape rather than fighting for us. I reminded her of counseling proposals declined, of vacations postponed, of dinners canceled. "You stopped noticing me long before I stopped being there," I said. The wind moved between us like punctuation. When she left that evening, nothing was reconciled, but truth had at least been spoken without shouting. Time continued its indifferent march. I began teaching adjunct courses on intellectual property ethics at a regional college, redirecting my expertise toward mentorship rather than corporate defense. The act of teaching grounded me in presence. Students asked questions not because they required my income, but because they valued insight. Leora eventually chose to simplify her surname, removing the hyphenated combination she once carried, retaining mine alone. She explained it was not rejection of her mother but recognition of who had consistently shown up. That acknowledgement cut deeper than any online commentary. It affirmed that visibility is earned through presence, not provision alone. Meanwhile, Seraphine secured a modest position within a nonprofit organization. Her salary drastically reduced, but her schedule stabilized. Through Leora, I learned she had entered therapy voluntarily. Whether remorse stemmed from loss or awakening, I could not fully know. What I did know was that my absence had forced reflection neither of us had previously allowed. Nearly 3 years after the gala, We finalized the dissolution paperwork quietly in a public park halfway between our residences. No theatrics, no lawyers posturing, just signatures acknowledging what had already dissolved emotionally long before legal formalities. As we parted, she wished me visibility in whatever life I built next. I wished her peace rooted not in titles but in self-awareness. Walking away that afternoon felt different from the night I left the ballroom. That first departure had been shock crystallizing into action. This one felt like release. I did not erase myself from existence as I once claimed in private bitterness. I erased only the version of myself that accepted invisibility as the price of companionship. What remained was not a legend, not a villain, not a martyr, just a man who finally decided that being present in his own life required refusing to stand silently while someone else negotiated his worth. The years that followed did not explode into some cinematic transformation. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a blueprint being drafted line by line. I remained in the mountains far longer than I originally intended, not because I was hiding, but because the isolation gave me space to hear my own thoughts without interruption. The cabin became less of a refuge and more of a workshop for reconstruction. I converted the small spare room into a study overlooking the tree line, and each morning I sat at the desk before sunrise, writing. At first the writing was private, fragments of memory, timelines of conversations, reflections on moments I had dismissed at the time but now understood as warning signs. I wasn't interested in vilifying Seraphine. I was interested in understanding how two intelligent adults could coexist for so many years while failing to truly see one another. The deeper I wrote, the clearer it became that invisibility is rarely imposed overnight. It accumulates in layers of compromise, in jokes brushed aside, in invitations declined, in subtle power shifts where one partner's ambition becomes the axis around which everything else rotates. I began shaping those reflections into essays about boundaries, autonomy, and emotional presence. What surprised me was not the catharsis of writing, but the clarity it provided. For the first time in decades, I was articulating my internal landscape without filtering it to preserve someone else's comfort. The act of putting language to experience felt less like retaliation and more like excavation, as though I were uncovering a version of myself long buried beneath accommodation. Eventually, those essays found their way beyond my hard drive. A former colleague, unaware of the full context of my departure, but aware of my professional credibility, suggested I submit one piece to a legal ethics journal discussing personal asset protection within marriages. The article was published under my name, and it sparked unexpected discussion, not because of scandal, but because it addressed a reality many professionals quietly feared: the vulnerability of assuming permanence in personal partnerships. Invitations to speak at small conferences followed. I accepted cautiously, emphasizing that preparation is not paranoia and that safeguarding oneself does not equate to hostility. In each lecture, I made it clear that communication should always precede contingency, but contingency should never be shamed. Word spread gradually. Some attendees recognized parallels to rumors that had circulated about my own situation, though I neither confirmed nor denied specifics publicly. The more I spoke, the more I realized how many individuals, men and women alike, felt unseen in their relationships yet hesitated to articulate it for fear of appearing ungrateful. The conversations after each event lingered long after the formal sessions ended. Strangers would approach me quietly, confessing they had begun to disappear in their own homes. I listened more than I spoke. Listening, I learned, is a form of visibility too. Leora visited the cabin for the first time nearly a year after my departure. She arrived with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder and an expression that balanced curiosity with caution. We spent the weekend hiking narrow trails, cooking simple meals, and talking without urgency. She asked questions I had anticipated and others I had not. "Were you ever going to come back if she hadn't said yes that night?" she asked at one point as we sat beside a stream. I considered the question carefully. The honest answer was complicated. That dinner invitation was not the origin of my departure, it was the confirmation. Even if she had declined publicly, the years preceding it would still have required confrontation. I explained that sometimes a single moment illuminates a pattern already present. Leora nodded slowly, absorbing that. She did not demand that I justify every decision. She only needed to know that I had not left impulsively. By the time she departed Sunday evening, there was a softness between us that had been strained for months. She hugged me longer than usual before driving away, and I recognized that rebuilding trust with a child requires patience without defensiveness. Meanwhile, Seraphine's life recalibrated in quieter ways. Through occasional updates from Leora, I learned she had downsized to a modest apartment near her nonprofit office. The high-powered wardrobe gave way to practical attire. Networking galas were replaced by community fundraising events. Therapy sessions became routine rather than reactionary. At first, I resisted the temptation to interpret these changes as either redemption or defeat. They were simply evolution under pressure. I did not celebrate her hardships, but neither did I offer to reverse them. There is a difference between compassion and reentry. Compassion acknowledges humanity, reentry reestablishes proximity. I chose the former without the latter. Months passed without direct communication between us. The silence was no longer charged, it was neutral. And in that neutrality I found something unexpected, relief unaccompanied by bitterness. Teaching gradually became more central to my identity than litigation had ever been. Students were blunt, inquisitive, and unafraid to challenge assumptions. In one seminar, a young woman asked whether preparing legal safeguards in a marriage undermines trust. The room fell quiet, waiting for my response. I answered honestly, trust and structure are not adversaries. Airplanes have multiple safety systems not because pilots expect failure, but because redundancy preserves stability. Marriage, I suggested, benefits from similar clarity. Transparency in financial architecture does not signal suspicion. It signals respect for mutual autonomy. The discussion that followed was robust, thoughtful, and devoid of the gendered hostility I often saw online. It reinforced my belief that the next generation is more willing to confront uncomfortable realities directly rather than romanticize them. After class, several students lingered to continue debating boundaries and emotional labor. I walked back to the cabin that evening feeling useful in a way I hadn't in years, not as a provider, not as a defender, but as a participant in meaningful dialogue. 2 winters after I left the gala, I received a letter in the mail rather than an email or text. The handwriting was unmistakably Seraphine's. She wrote not to plead or accuse, but to reflect. Therapy, she explained, had forced her to examine how achievement had become her armor. She admitted that professional validation had often felt safer than marital intimacy because success could be quantified, whereas vulnerability could not. She acknowledged minimizing my earlier attempts at connection and mistaking my steadiness for inexhaustibility. The letter did not ask for reconciliation. It asked only that I know she understood more now than she had then. I read the letter twice before placing it in a drawer. Understanding after loss is bittersweet. It validates your experience while confirming the irreversibility of what was missed. I did not respond immediately. Some acknowledgments are meant to be received rather than answered. Leora's life advanced in its own direction. She accepted a promotion within her firm and began collaborating on sustainable housing projects in urban neighborhoods. Watching her carve out a path defined not solely by income, but by impact filled me with quiet pride. One evening during a video call she remarked, almost casually, "You know, Dad, I think both of you needed the break to become people instead of roles." The comment startled me with its clarity. Roles had indeed defined much of our marriage: provider, executive, supporter, strategist. When roles eclipse individuality, invisibility becomes inevitable. Leora had witnessed that dynamic from a distance, and perhaps my departure prevented her from internalizing it as normal. The thought comforted me. If nothing else, the rupture may have disrupted a generational pattern of silent endurance. As the third year approached, I noticed something subtle but profound. I no longer replayed the gala scene in my mind. For months it had looped like surveillance footage, frozen at the moment of her smile and consent. Gradually, the image lost its emotional charge. Memory remained, but it no longer dictated my mood. That shift signaled true release more than any signed document could. I began dating cautiously, not with urgency but curiosity. Conversations were transparent from the outset about expectations and boundaries. I refused to over-accommodate or underexpress. The first time I declined a dinner invitation because it conflicted with my own plans, and did so without apology. I recognized growth. Visibility begins with honoring your own time as much as you honor another's. One spring afternoon, while preparing lecture notes, I received news that Harold Whitcomb, the cabin's owner, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. His daughter honored his informal agreement with me, offering the property at a fair price before listing it publicly. I purchased it without hesitation. The cabin had become more than shelter. It symbolized the space where I reconstructed myself deliberately rather than reactively. Standing on the porch after signing the paperwork, I reflected on how easily I could have allowed resentment to calcify during those early months. Instead, solitude had clarified rather than corroded me. Loss can harden or refine depending on whether you engage it with curiosity or defensiveness. I chose curiosity, even when it was uncomfortable. Looking back now, what strikes me most is not the drama of departure, but the ordinariness of the factors that led to it. No affair was ever proven. No explosive scandal erupted. Just years of incremental disregard culminating in a public confirmation of misalignment. Many marriages dissolve more quietly than they explode. Mine simply reached a point where silence felt more violent than exit. I did not erase myself from existence. I reintroduced myself to it. The man who walked out of that ballroom carried anger tightly coiled beneath restraint. The man who stands on this porch today carries boundaries instead. Boundaries are quieter than anger but infinitely more sustainable. If there is any lesson embedded in this long arc of departure and reconstruction, it is that being seen by others begins with refusing to look away from yourself. And once you commit to that, disappearance is no longer an escape, it becomes a return.